Evening in a small kitchen outside Chicago. Warm yellow light, steam rising from a simple pot of soup. Daniel Brooks, 41, a single father, is stirring the pot. His daughter Emma, 9, is drawing at the table. The meal is basic: vegetable soup, toasted day-old bread. Emma smiles. "It smells like home." Daniel grins. A normal evening, nothing special. Until a knock at the door. Daniel opens it. A woman, 27, in a long coat, damp from the rain. She looks at him for 5 seconds. She whispers, "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." Daniel freezes. The story begins now. Daniel Brooks was a man of steel, silence, and absolute rhythmic routine. At 41, his face was a map of quiet focus in the deep, enduring weariness of a man who worked 2 lives, one to keep the physical world running and one to keep a small home safe. He was a professional appliance repairman, a master of the mechanical, who spent his days in the basements of suburbs, fixing leaking washers and temperamental furnaces. He was the guy who understood the language of machines, the one who knew that a single loose screw could vibrate a whole system into failure. But when the clock hit 5 p.m., the technician vanished. He became Dad, the most important title he had ever held. Daniel's life was a masterpiece of managed survival. 5 years ago, his world had been surgically hollowed out when his wife, Sarah, passed away. In the aftermath of that storm, Daniel had systematically dismantled his old life. He had previously been a rising star in a global logistics firm, a man of airports, power suits, and endless spreadsheets. He was winning the rat race, but he was losing his soul. Sarah's death taught him a brutal, irreversible lesson about the value of time. He walked away from the high-pressure career without a second thought. He didn't want a promotion. He wanted to be at the school gate at 3:15 p.m. every single day. He traded the corner office for a toolbelt because his daughter's presence was a currency that no stock option could ever replace. Their house in the quiet outskirts of Chicago was small, a modest brick bungalow that required constant maintenance. But it was alive. The scent of vanilla, old books, and the faint metallic tang of motor oil defined their world. The walls were covered in Emma's watercolors, many depicting lighthouses standing strong against crashing waves. The furniture was a collection of rescued pieces Daniel had repaired himself, each chair and table holding a story of restoration. They lived in a state of aggressive simplicity. They didn't have the newest tablets or the flashiest cars, but they had a dining table that saw every meal shared and a porch that saw every sunset watched together. Emma, at 9, was the architect of their happiness. She was a bright, intuitive child who possessed her father's quiet observation skills and her mother's boundless empathy. She knew they didn't have much money compared to the families in the glossy magazines, but she never used the word poor. To Emma, money was just a tool to keep the lights on. Real wealth was the way her dad tucked her in with a story every single night without fail, his hands still warm from a day of work. She saw the beauty in the small things, the way the dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, and the way the vegetable soup bubbled on the stove. "Dad, are we having the secret soup again?" Emma asked this evening, leaning over her sketchbook, her tongue tucked in the corner of her mouth as she shaded a drawing of a tree. Daniel stirred the pot, the steam fogging his glasses and filling the room with the scent of onions, carrots, and rosemary. The soup was a collection of whatever vegetables were on sale that week, slow-simmered with herbs from their tiny window box garden. It was cheap, it was basic, but it was consistent. "The secret soup is our trademark, pal," Daniel replied, his voice a low, grounding rumble. "It's the only recipe in the world that gets better every time you add a new question to it. Tonight the question is, how many stars are hidden behind the rain?" Emma laughed, a rich, bubbling sound that seemed to chase the chill out of the corners of the room. "I think it smells like a warm blanket for our tummies." Daniel smiled, but as he looked out the window at the gray, rain-streaked Chicago evening, he felt the weight of the coming month's property taxes. He was making enough to be safe, but never enough to be comfortable. Yet as he watched his daughter draw, he realized he wouldn't trade their small, warm kitchen for all the glass-walled boardrooms in the world. He believed that enough was a choice, not a number. He had built a fortress of normalcy against the chaos of the city, unaware that his door was about to be the only thing standing between a billionaire and a total mental breakdown. He was the guardian of a warmth he didn't even know was rare. Many families aren't rich, but they are complete, because enough isn't found in a bank account. It's found in the presence of someone who stays when the world gets loud. You can have everything and still have nothing if you're eating alone. The rain outside had transitioned from a gentle drizzle into a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against the roof. Inside, the kitchen was a sanctuary of amber light and domestic peace. Daniel was just about to set the table, carefully placing the mismatched ceramic bowls when the sound arrived. A hesitant, desperate knock at the front door. It wasn't the confident knock of a delivery driver or the familiar, heavy rap of a neighbor. It was the sound of a hand that was almost too tired to reach out, a plea for help disguised as a greeting. Daniel paused, the ladle still in his hand, droplets of soup falling back into the pot. He looked at Emma, who had stopped drawing, her eyes wide with a quiet, observant curiosity. He walked to the door, his heavy work boots sounding solid and grounding on the old floorboards. When he pulled the door open, the cold, wet breath of the night rushed into the hallway, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and electricity. Standing there was a woman who looked like she had walked straight out of a different, much more expensive reality. She was about 27, wearing a long, tailored wool coat that probably cost more than Daniel's entire truck. Her hair was damp and matted, sticking to her pale, translucent cheeks. But it was her eyes that stopped Daniel in his tracks. They were a terrifying shade of red, raw, bloodshot, and filled with the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. These were the eyes of someone who had been staring at a wall for 72 hours and had finally realized the wall wasn't going to talk back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. I saw the light in your window. I didn't know where else to go. Everywhere else is too loud. I can't go back there." Daniel didn't see a stranger. He didn't see a threat. He saw a system that had reached its terminal breaking point. He had spent his life fixing machines that were overheating or seizing up, and he knew exactly what it looked like when a human being was about to collapse. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't ask for her ID. He simply stepped back, opening the door wide to the warmth of his home. "Come in," Daniel said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "It's cold outside. You're shivering." The woman stepped into the hallway, her movements stiff and fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. She looked around the warm, messy entryway as if she were walking through a dream. The air in Daniel's house smelled of cinnamon, old wood, and the savory, grounding scent of the secret soup. To a woman who had been living in the sterile, suffocating vacuum of high-stakes corporate warfare, the normalcy of the room was almost an assault on her senses. It was too real, too human. Her name was Clara Hayes. To the rest of the world, she was the heiress, the sole successor to Hayes Global Logistics. She had just walked out of a boardroom where her own uncles were trying to strip her of her voting shares, using her father's declining health as a weapon against her. She had spent the last 6 hours being screamed at, lied to, and treated like a variable on a spreadsheet. She had driven away from the skyscrapers, driving until the city turned into neighborhoods, and then she had simply stopped. She couldn't go back to her glass penthouse. She couldn't go to a hotel. She just needed to be somewhere that didn't feel like a transaction. Emma walked up to her, holding a small, hand-knitted blue throw blanket that Sarah had made years ago. "You can sit here," Emma said softly, pointing to the worn-out but comfortable armchair near the kitchen. "We have soup. Dad says soup is the best way to dry your hair from the inside out." Clara looked at the little girl and then at the man in the work shirt. She felt a sudden, sharp, and painful lump in her throat. She had billions in her name, but no one had offered her a blanket in 3 long years. No one had asked her if she was cold. She sat down, her knuckles bone white as she clutched the soft wool. Daniel didn't interrogate her. He understood that when someone is drowning, you don't ask for their resume before you pull them out of the water. He simply went to the kitchen, poured a large, steaming bowl of the hot vegetable soup, and placed it on the table in front of her. He added a thick slice of the toasted bread, still warm from the oven. "Eat," Daniel directed. "The bread is a little old, but it's toasted well. The soup is hot. The rest of the world can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, you're just a person in a storm." Clara took a tentative spoonful. The heat of the broth hit her stomach, and for the first time in months, the icy tension in her chest began to melt. She wasn't being consulted. She wasn't being leveraged. She was just being fed. She looked at Daniel, who was now helping Emma set the rest of the table, as if having a billionaire in their kitchen was the most natural thing in the world. He treated her not as a CEO, but as a guest who needed a seat. The silence in the room was sharing a heavy weight. Daniel didn't offer a corporate platitude. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He simply gave her a safe place to breathe. Clara realized then that people don't always need a big solution or a strategic plan. Sometimes they just need a chair, a bowl of soup, and a room where no one is judging their exhaustion. People don't always need a hero. Sometimes they just need a witness. In a world full of people trying to fix everything, the most powerful thing you can do is simply provide a safe space where someone doesn't have to be okay. A bowl of soup is a better medicine than 1,000 boardroom speeches. The dinner proceeded with a rhythm that was entirely, beautifully real. There were no servers in white gloves. There was no protocol or assigned seating. There was only the rhythmic clink of spoons against ceramic and the muffled sound of the wind howling outside. Daniel sat across from Clara, his presence a solid anchor, while Emma sat between them, chattering about her school project on the migration patterns of monarch butterflies. "Butterflies don't have a GPS," Emma explained to Clara, waving a piece of crusty bread in the air to emphasize her point. "They just follow the warmth. My dad says humans are the same way, but sometimes we get our wires crossed and end up in the cold. We forget which way the sun is." Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that she hadn't used in years. It felt foreign on her face, pulling at muscles she had forgotten she possessed. "Your dad is very wise, Emma. I think my wires have been crossed for a very, very long time. I think I lost my son." Daniel looked at Clara over the rim of his water glass. He saw the way she handled the spoon with a natural grace that suggested years of formal education and expensive etiquette, and the way she looked at the modest kitchen with a mixture of awe and envy. He realized that this woman wasn't just tired. She was starving for substance. She was dying of thirst in a desert of luxury. "You're from the city," or Daniel noted quietly, "the part where the lights never go out and the noise never stops." Clara nodded, her gaze drifting to the simple wooden cabinets and the hand-painted spice jars. "I'm from the part where the lights are so bright you can't see the stars. I spent today in a room with 12 men who have known me since I was a baby, and every single one of them was trying to find a way to make me disappear. They think that because I'm just the daughter, I don't belong at the table. They've turned my father's legacy into a cold-blooded war zone. They've forgotten that he built it for people, not for percentages." She took a long, shuddering breath, the steam from the soup warming her face. "I walked out. I couldn't do it anymore. I left my phone on the desk. I left my car at the curb with the keys in it. I walked until I found a bus, and I rode it until the buildings got shorter and the air got quieter. I saw your window. It looked like a lighthouse in the dark. It looked like someone was home." Daniel didn't look impressed by her status. He didn't ask about her company's stock price or her net worth. He simply pushed the breadbasket toward her. "Boardrooms are just engines with too much friction, Clara. If you don't oil them with a bit of humanity, they eventually seize up and burn. It sounds like your engine has been running hot for too long. You've been trying to drive 100 miles an hour in an empty tank." "Do you make the same soup every week?" Clara asked, her voice regaining some of its natural strength and clarity. "Every week," Emma answered proudly, her eyes shimmering. "Sometimes with carrots, sometimes with potatoes, but it always tastes the same. It tastes like Saturday mornings. It tastes like Dad is home." Clara felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the broth. For years, she had lived in a world of innovations and disruptions. Everything was always changing, always moving, always demanding more, faster, better. But here, in this small house, the goal wasn't more. The goal was consistent. The goal was present. The goal was enough. She watched as Daniel reached over to wipe a smudge of soup from Emma's chin. It was a gesture of absolute, unshielded love, a gesture that was entirely free, yet more valuable than anything in her bank vault. Clara realized then that she had been measuring her life by the wrong metrics. She had been chasing impact and dominance, while this man was building a world out of heart-shaped pancakes and vegetable soup. She had been looking for power, but he had found peace. "You don't have a television in here," Clara noted, noticing the lack of a flickering blue glow in the living room. "We have books," Daniel replied, pointing to the overflowing shelves. "And we have each other. A screen just makes the room feel smaller and the world feel louder. We prefer the view from the porch and the stories we make up ourselves." As the meal ended, Emma began to clear the plates with a practiced efficiency. She didn't complain about the chore. She didn't ask for a reward. She was simply part of the team, doing her part to maintain the sanctuary. Clara stood up to help, but Daniel shook his head, his hand resting gently on the table. "You're a guest, Clara. Just sit. Enjoy the quiet. It's the only thing in this house that's truly expensive, and we have plenty to share." Clara sat back down. She looked at the man in the work shirt and realized that Daniel Brooks was the wealthiest man she had ever met. Not because of what he had in his bank account, but because he was the only one who truly knew his own value. He didn't need a skyscraper to feel tall. He didn't need a merger to feel successful. He was a father, a provider, and a man who knew how to make a simple meal feel like a royal feast. Act 3 was the moment of absolute clarity. In the middle of a city of millions, in a place defined by noise and competition, 3 people had created a sanctuary of absolute, unshielded truth. Clara realized that she hadn't come here to be saved by a miracle. She had come here to be reminded of what was worth saving in herself. She was saving a future where a meal could just be a meal and a home could just be a home. She was learning that the greatest luxury in the world is to be known for who you are, not for what you own. A meal doesn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. It just needs the right people and the feeling of being allowed to stay. True luxury isn't found in a 5-star menu. It's found in the silence of a room where no one wants anything from you except your presence. The plates were cleared, and the kitchen was once again filled with the soft, white noise of the rain. Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea Daniel had prepared. She looked at her reflection in the dark window and barely recognized the woman staring back. The Ice Queen was gone. "My life doesn't look like this, Daniel," Clara said suddenly. Her voice was clear now, no longer a whisper. "It looks like spreadsheets and security details. It looks like people who only smile when they want a signature. I thought I was building something important. But looking at you and Emma, I feel like I've been building a very expensive cage." Daniel sat on the stool by the counter, wiping a wrench he had left out. "Most lives don't look like this, Clara. We live in a world that's obsessed with the high altitude. Everyone wants to be on the top floor. But the problem with the top floor is that you're too far away from the ground to see the people walking on it. You forget what the dirt feels like." Clara laughed softly, a bitter edge touching the sound. "The dirt feels honest. My world, it feels like plastic." "Then change the material," Daniel suggested. "You're the one holding the pen, aren't you? If you don't like the blueprint, draw a new one. It's just physics, Clara. If a structure is under too much tension, you either strengthen the foundation or you reduce the load. You can't just keep adding floors and hoping the wind doesn't blow." Clara looked at Emma, who was now curled up on the sofa with a book, her breathing deep and rhythmic. "You built something simple, but it's the most real thing I've seen in a decade. You pick her up from school. You make the same soup. You stay. Why? You have the mind for so much more. I've seen your technical notes on the furnace. You're overqualified for this." Daniel paused, his eyes turning reflective. "Because I realized that the more wasn't for me. It was for my ego. And my ego wasn't the one who needed a dad at 3 p.m. Emma was. I didn't settle, Clara. I aligned. I found the frequency that let me sleep at night and wake up with a smile in the morning. That's the only RO I care about now. Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. The walls she had built over 3 long years were finally starting to show deep, permanent cracks. She realized that she had been chasing a version of success that her father hadn't even wanted for her. He had wanted her to be strong, yes, but he had also wanted her to be happy. I thought if I gave up the fight, I was failing him, Clara whispered. Failing him would be losing yourself in the process, Daniel replied. He didn't build an empire so his daughter could be a ghost inside it. He built it so you could have a choice. Tonight, you chose to walk away from the noise. That's not a failure, Clara. That's a recalibration. The conversation hung there, raw and honest. Daniel hadn't just given a billionaire a meal. He had given her a mirror. He had shown her that her complexity was actually a form of poverty, and his simplicity was a form of wealth. The rain was slowing down, and the city lights were starting to peek through the clouds. But for Clara Hayes, the view was forever different. A complicated life isn't always a better one. Many people spend their whole lives trying to reach the top, only to realize they left everything that mattered at the bottom. True intelligence is knowing when to simplify so you can finally start to live. The rain had finally stopped. The air outside was cool, crisp, and smelled of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine. Clara stood at the front door, her coat buttoned tight, her posture no longer rigid but grounded. She looked back at the small kitchen one last time. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, "for the soup and for letting me stay." Daniel gave a small, humble nod, leaning against the doorframe. "You didn't need permission, Clara. The light was on. It usually is." Emma came running from the sofa, rubbing her eyes. She reached out and gave Clara a quick, fierce hug. "You can come back anytime, even if it's not raining. Dad always makes extra soup on Tuesdays." Clara knelt down and hugged the little girl back. "I think I might just do that, Emma. I think I've been eating at my desk for far too long." As Clara walked toward the car she had finally called to pick her up, she didn't look at her phone. She didn't check the morning's market opening. She looked at the sky. For the first time in years, the clouds had cleared enough to see a single, bright star hanging over the neighborhood. Daniel watched her go. He saw the way she walked, not with the frantic pace of a CEO, but with the steady, measured stride of a woman who had finally found her footing. He closed the door, the click of the lock sounding peaceful in the quiet hallway. He walked back to the kitchen and began to wash the 3 bowls. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like he had changed a billionaire's life. He just felt like a dad who had finished his shift. But in that small bungalow on the outskirts of Chicago, the atmosphere had changed. The silence was no longer a defense. It was a connection. The story of the single dad and the billionaire didn't end with a merger or a headline. It ended with a simple Tuesday evening. But in that room, in that city of millions, the frequency had shifted. A few more people were looking at the eyes instead of the labels. A few more doors were being left open. True change. It doesn't require a miracle or a government program. It just requires an open door, a warm bowl of soup, and a person willing to sit in the silence until the noise goes away. Daniel Brooks was home, and for the first time in a long time, the view was perfect. Sometimes a normal evening becomes the thing you remember forever. Not because it was large, but because it was real. Don't wait for a crisis to open your door. The most important connection you'll ever make might be sitting right in front of you, waiting for a bowl of soup. Value isn't defined by what you own, but by the space you provide for others. A simple life lived with integrity is more powerful than a complex one lived in a cage. Never underestimate the power of an open door. It might be the only bridge someone has back to themselves. If you believe that simple moments can change everything, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you have opened your door to a stranger in the rain? What is your secret soup?